Welcome to the sixth lecture in the Historical Linguistics series, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome back Horst Simon, who has been delivering these lectures. When was it first? In 2011, when he was in London, at King's College London. Then he returned to Germany, is now professor of historical linguistics at the Freie Universität Berlin, but has kept in close contact. And several of his books are on the reading list for paper 4 students. And I remember the first time I met a published author in real life, and it seemed a bit uncanny to see Huber 1990 suddenly standing as a living person in front of me. So you have this slightly uncanny appearance of you. The topic of the gendered language is relevant for several of the essay topics, actually. Intersecting also with forms of address, on which Horst Simon also has written, and a topic that is really fascinating to look across all the periods from developing from the Old High German period right to current topics. But before taking away any of the actual Zunder of the lecture, I'll hand over to Horst Simon to speak on 3 spotlights on historical grammar and social linguistics.
So thanks again for having me with you this time around now today. You will have realized that I've changed the title of the presentation slightly because I wasn't sure what gendered language is. So I guess I'm going to talk about gender in language in one way or the other, and look at 3 different aspects of gender and language and how they interact with and what's happening and what's interesting there. And obviously, gender and language will be a huge topic. And back in Berlin, occasionally I teach a 16-week 4 hours per week course on gender and language. So I thought maybe it will be slightly too much for you now. So I'm going to spotlight only 3 aspects where I think that come from completely different historical periods, but where you can see something happening that might be interesting from the point of view of grammar and social linguistics in a historical perspective. So this is not a complete story or anything, just 3 more or less unrelated topics that are bound together in a very abstract way by the idea of what is good language, what is appropriate language, what is polite language, and how should you behave, maybe. But apart from that, there's very little that connects those 3 topics. The 3 topics I want to talk about is 1, how you're addressing males in the feminine. At a certain period in the 17th century, that's what you did. You used feminine forms to address male people. And then we move back in time to the very beginning. I'll tell you something about still sex. I hadn't read Judith Butler back then, so they thought about sexes still. So it's mixed sex groups in Old High German and how we refer to them. And then we move back again into the contemporary period and look at what's happening today when you talk about people and things that might be happening there from a social linguistic and from a historical social linguistic point of view. So if you're interested in any of these topics in more detail, the best book to look at gender is by Helga Kotthoff and Damaris Nübling. 2nd edition came out just about a bit more than a year ago on gender linguistics. They'll tell you anything you might want to need when you look at the grammatical, but also at the interactional perspectives on gender and language and how they intersect. And for the historical perspective, the ones that I'm going to talk about, it's going to be about pronouns and politeness. Another book by Damaris Nübling and some of her colleagues, the chapter 7.3 is the one where you can read the full story of pronouns of address on a very condensed way in a couple of pages only. So if you don't want to read a full book on that topic, just little condensation in this chapter. If you can wait for another couple of weeks, there's going to be a 6th edition. It's already just gone, the proofs have gone to the publisher, but are not out yet. So if you still have time to wait for 2 months, you get the new edition, otherwise you get the 5th one. Too late. The 5th one is good as well, so don't worry. So first thing I'm going to talk about is gender in pronouns of address, and that might surprise you, because you doesn't make any gender distinction, and most vous French doesn't make a gender distinction, use it to any kind of person. So pronouns of address and gender might be somewhat surprising. It might also be surprising when you look at languages at large. And Joe Greenberg already found out in the 60s, when he looked at all the languages, many languages of the world, he said that gender distinctions are relatively rare in the first person. So me, I, it's very rare that you have a gender distinction there. And if you have it, you also have it in the second or in the third person, or even in both. Or to put it another way, grammatical gender is something that typically occurs with nouns and with third-person pronouns, and sometimes with concomitant articles and all that, but rarely in the second person. But that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to look at gendered address in a particular period of the German linguistic history, namely the early New High German period, 16th and actually mostly 17th century. So this is the chart of what happened all over the whole period of German pronouns of address. And it started out, it started out with the du and ihr distinction sometime in the early Middle Ages, like the contemporary tu, vous in French, or the equivalent in Russian, so single, or Shakespearean English, where you have a singular and a second-person plural pronoun. And then you see a rather complicated story that happened in the meantime, and at the very end you see our contemporary do-see distinction, the one we're all struggling with when we use contemporary German. So there was a long history there. Today I'm going to focus on what is here called Stufe 3, the one where you had an sie singular as a pronoun of address to a single person. So that's the only thing I'm going to talk about for today's lecture. So this would be a slightly outdated usage today. It's a very subservient way of saying it, but you can still feel it, I assume. So it's like, hat der Herr noch einen Wunsch, möchte er noch etwas trinken? And the same for females, hat die Dame noch einen Wunsch, möchte sie noch etwas trinken? So very subservient way of language use. But here you can see a third-person singular pronoun used for addressing a single person, either by er or by sie, depending on the perceived gender of the person you're talking to. Now, in the past, you had some of those honorative nouns, like der Herr, die Dame, that are neuter, like, for instance, das Fräulein. And there you get examples like this one. This from a novel from the mid-17th century. Wann es mein gnädiges Fräulein im besten vermerken wollte, so könnte ich ihm, third person singular neuter dative, noch wohl den wahren Sinn eröffnen. So könnte ich ihm, the Fräulein is taken up anaphorically by a third-person singular neuter pronoun, and that's you can't see this from it's not the context. It's really this is a sentence said towards a single woman. So therefore, this is a pronoun of address, a third-person singular neuter towards a single female conceived person. Now. In the 17th century, there are all kinds of nominal abstractions, like Your Honor, Your Majesty, that kind of nominal abstractions that are used in polite address, like Your Honor, again, in language like English. And the interesting thing is, in German, all of those nominal abstractions are feminine nouns. So the nouns are feminine gender. So when you use them in polite address, the anaphora with them is the C, third-person singular feminine. And this is irrespective of the addressee of the gender. Of the gender of the addressee, that way around. So whoever you're talking to, if it's a majesty, you say Your Majesty, and then you take it up with third-person singular feminine pronoun. If you don't believe me, I'll show you an example. A drama by Andreas Gryphius about King Charles III, the one that English king, the one was beheaded. And you see here that Juxton says something like, drückt Ihre Majestät noch ein verborgen Leid, hat sie der kurzen Nacht genossen, sonder Sorgen. So this is a servant talking to the king and using the pronoun third person singular feminine. So that might come as a surprise, because what happened later was that the grammatical gender was realigned to the perceived sexual gender of the addressee, or the social gender, if you want to put it like this. So you have, at the very beginning, they had the C to any kind of person, as long as it took up anaphorically a Majestät. It was before that. Later, what they did is, you saw this with the hat die Dame noch einen Wunsch, möchte sie noch etwas. You looked at the perceived social gender of your addressee and then used er and sie according to this, to the gender that you perceived. So there was a change there in the grammatical status of those forms. They were only used anaphorically at the beginning and were later used pragmatically, depending on the perceived gender of the person you're talking to. Now, this is not a specialty of German as such. This happens in other languages as well. I'll give you an example from Italian. Today, the polite pronoun of Italian is lei, at least in the northern standard variety of Italian. And this, again, is the second person singular feminine oblique pronoun. It's the same pronoun that you use as her, basically. And this goes back to nominal abstractions like vostra signoria, vostra eccellenza, and they're all feminine again. Therefore, this lei got into the system, again, anaphorically, and was grammaticalized in the feminine form, at least in northern Italy, I should say, as the polite pronoun towards any kind of person, irrespective of their gender. Similarly to what happened in German afterwards, that they split up with er and sie and those two forms, you see this in northern Italian dialects, like in Piedmont and Lombardy, where they have different forms for males and for females, again, third person singular, feminine, and masculine. Now, again, also happens playing around with genders, grammatical genders, social genders, also plays a role, like, for instance, in various varieties of Arabic. You can see here the High Arabic personal pronoun paradigm, and what you see is in the second person pronouns do have two different forms. There's an opposition between anta and anti in the singular and other forms in the plural, and they are all over the place in the Arabic system. Second person pronouns do have a gender distinction inbuilt into the system. So that's one thing. Now, the interesting thing, you could play around with that. So what you do is, in Tunisian English, for instance, if you're an educated person, you use the inti form, the second person singular feminine, for all kinds of addressees, showing your urbanness, and you're not a backward rural person. I'm the one who uses the feminine for whatever reason. In Lebanese English, you can Lebanese Arabic, sorry, you can use the second person singular feminine if you want to demasculinize your aggressor. So, or as an aggression. So if you're in a male-male competition on an aggressive situation, and you, as a male person, and are addressing the other male person with the feminine pronoun, it symbolically castrates the other person, and this is a kind of an aggressive act, and is in itself the thing that is the impolite aspect. You also have the other way around. In the Yemen, for instance, you can address older people with the second person plural masculine, which is okay for males, but you can also use it for females, and then it's polite. So you can address a female person with the masculine pronoun in Yemenite Arabic in order to give her the honorary status of male honoris causa, so to speak. So, and that again is a politeness thing towards this woman, then, typically done with older women in this society. So, and this actually is something that happens in various other Semitic languages. In Hebrew, a couple of years ago, there was a lawsuit in Ethiopia because somebody had used the wrong pronoun in a male-male aggressive situation in Tigrinya, and they had a lawsuit about that. So it seems to be irrelevant for those societies to use either the right pronoun or to not use the right pronoun, and by virtue of not using the right one, being either overly polite or overly impolite. So that's the thing that's happening there. So what you'll see is those gender mismatches, the social gender and the grammatical gender mismatches. You have on the one hand the social metaphors in the Arabic case, this symbolic demasculinization, or the male as a male honoris causa case. And you also have in early New High German and in Italian dialects the metaphor and metonymy of saying your honor, your majesty, something. And this, in connection with grammatical agreement, leads to, sometimes at least, feminine forms being used mismatchedly towards male perceived people. So that's one thing where you see the interaction of genders, social genders, and grammatical genders. Now, moving back a long way back in time to mixed sex groups in Old High German. So what's happening here is, let's look at French first. You have something like, in French you simply have two pronouns, two genders, and you have il for a single man, elle for a single woman, and the same in the plural. That's easy. What happens if you talk to a group of people? And only recently they come up with a new pronoun il, that's being used, originally it was only used in the plural to refer to mixed sex groups as a new pronoun for mixed groups in French. And even more recently, they also have the singular form il now, if you want to refer to a person and irrespective of the gender of this particular person. Now, what about German? Today it's simple because when you talk about a group of people, it's sie plural, and like in English they, and it doesn't tell you anything about genders anyway. So that's, in that sense, there's no problem. In Middle High German, they had two forms for third-person plural pronouns. You had the masculine and the feminine sie, and the neuter plural sü. And in Old High German, even had three forms. So it had three forms for the third-person plural, and they are related to the grammatical gender, and also, we will see in a second, to kind of a social gender thing. So let's give you an example for this. So I have two people, Zacharias and Elisabeth, and they are very nice people, and they were good, and they are, sie waren recht you, beide vor Gotte. So that's a piece of the Old High German Tatian translation from the early 9th century. And what you see here is, and this is what it translates. It translates the erant autem justi, and in the modern French translation of the same Bible, segment of the Bible, it doesn't tell you anything about the just people, but a bit later on the same text, it says, il n'avait point d'enfant. So what you see here is, in the French, it's a man and a woman, and they refer to together with il, masculine, because that's what standard officially sanctioned French grammar tells you, masculine if it's a mixed group. Same happened in the Latin case, justi. In Old High German, they have the neuter. So it's the siu as the neuter third-person plural pronoun when you refer to a group that consists of both men and women, or in this case, one man and one woman. Together, they become neuter. Interestingly, actually, I forgot to look up the English word for rasur. Erasure. So what's happening in the actual the Tatian Sangal manuscript that is in Sangal today, there's actually an erasure exactly of so the U of siu is exactly on an erased form that was before that. So apparently, at least the scribe that originally had written it, or at least there must have been some variation going on in the minds of those people there. It was already apparently on the brink of dissolving this. Could well be that there was a dissolving of this particular distinction even in Old High German. It's quite curious that there's one of the very few erasure cases in the manuscript exactly at this point. So there must be something going on there. But anyway, it's not the only example you have. There's others, like in Ottfried, the same thing. Sio Furun von Thierburg. Again, it's a group of people consisting of males and females. And even in Middle High German, you have at least some examples of Mann und Weib, du sind allein in Passival. So again, du, another dir. You see here, again, the plural neuter when they talk about a man and a woman. So you see this indefinites as a neutralization. The neuter as a neutralization strategy for this gender thing going on. And today it's gone completely in third-person plural pronouns because it's only C. There's nothing you can see there anymore. But you can see it in other cases. For instance, in my native language, you have something like a neuter indefinite. So when I talk to people in my village, I can say, in unserem Dorf hat a jeder sein eigenes Vorradl, a jeder, and this means it's only men I'm talking about, or a jede hat sein eigenes Vorradl, then it's only females. And if I want to say that everybody in my village, irrespective of what their gender might be, I'd say, in unserem Dorf hat a jeds sein eigenes Vorradl. And so again, you see here the neuter as a way out, or as a way in to include all kinds of genders in those indefinites. So this was my second example. How do you refer to a group of people with various gender identities? Now, let's move on to today's situation and move beyond the third plural and see what else might play a role there. And the one is, you can look at the third person singular, what's happening there. And also, and that's what is more part of the public debate in Germany at the moment, what do you do with nouns in the singular and in the plural? So again, gender things coming up there with nominal constructions, not only with pronouns as we saw before, but also with nouns. Because in those cases, an elegant neuter solution like the one you had in Bavarian or in Old High German doesn't work with those nouns, so you have to find out other ways of doing it. And in a sense, the phenomenon I'm talking about has several names. Some people call it, have a verb for it, it's gendern, which is usually used more by people who are in favor of this practice. And then there's another group of people in Germany today who tend to be against this type of linguistic practice, and they usually call it Gendersprache or Gendergaga even. So this would be, so even by naming the actual phenomenon, whatever name and term you use, you're showing your affiliation towards this particular topic I'm talking about. And probably, in my opinion, it's the most important bone of contention in the public debate today when it comes to language and language change in Germany. So there's a lot of that in the public discussion. So you can see lots of newspaper articles and media contributions on particularly this topic. A couple of years ago, even more so. It's somehow flattened down the last 1 or 2 years maybe, but it's still a very important topic in the public debate. And it's, in a sense, it's part of a larger discussion on, well, whatever you want to call it, PC language use or appropriate languages or non-discriminatory language or all these things, whatever you want to call it. Should I use the N-word or the Z-word or should I not use it? So that's, and in that sense, gender language is one aspect of that. What's an appropriate way of referring to a group of people or to a single person, and should they do this or that, and what repercussions does it have on my opinion of you if you use one form or the other? And so let's again move back a bit to see the larger picture. In a sense, from a traditional point of view, life used to be very simple in the past. In the past, life was easy because you had males and females, and they're clearly distinguished. And for the ones you say he and she, or he and er and il, and for the others you say she and she, and that's a very simple system and very consistent. Similarly, if you have a group of those, group of men, you use the other one form. If you have a group of women, you use the other form. Again, very simple thing. And the good thing is, in English as well as in German today, you only have one form, so in a sense it doesn't matter whether it's males or females, it's just a C and a they. Now, in French, and we alluded to that already before, there is this problem. In French, traditional French grammar tells you a mixed group of people, and it could be one man and 75 women. One man, 75 women together, they are il, the masculine form. That's what prescriptive grammar tells you. Because, why is that so? Well, masculine wins, and I'll tell you in a second why that is so. But that's just the observation right now. Similarly, if you take nouns in German, there's one student and there's another Studentin, a couple of Studenten, couple of Studentinnen. So what happens if I talk to a group about a group like this, a mixed group? Well, traditional grammar tells you it's Studenten. Because there's one of those, a couple of those together, there must be the masculine, because masculine wins. Because that's at least what traditional people would tell you. Masculine is the unmarked category. And you see this all over the place in grammar. You see something like, wer hier zuhört, der maskulin kann viel lernen. Wem das gefällt, dem schenke ich ein Lächeln. Jeder, der zuhört, kann viel lernen. So all kinds of pronominal constructions, whatever pronoun you're using, the interrogative pronoun or an indefinite or whatever, masculine is always all right. That's the unmarked form, and traditional grammarians would tell you this has to do with markedness theory. So there's always, you have an opposite of two things. There's one is the usual, one is the unmarked, the normal one, and then there's a special one. And in a sense, it's true with certain nouns. When I say something like about, think about night and day, I can say, what's night and what is day? And, sometimes the sun is up, sometimes the moon is up. That's the difference between night and day. But then when I say something like, I'm on a trip to Oxford for a couple of days, you would imagine that I'm staying in Oxford during the days, but also when the moon is up during the night. So day is the unmarked member of this opposition, and you would not think that during the night I go to wherever else just to spend the night there and come back the next morning. So people would say there is this markedness asymmetry, and you see this with night and day, and at least, it's difficult to say this, some people will say the same is true for masculine and feminine, and you saw this before. Well, there's masculine, there's feminine, and masculine is just the unmarked form referring to both. Well, and the reason for that is what has been called the man principle, the male as norm principle, which is a widespread sociological fact. You see this in all kinds of things. See it with crash test dummies for car crashes and what playground. They are designed with the body shapes of male people and male body weight and all that kind of thing. And medicine, pharmaceutical products are usually tested according to male bodies and not to female. But there's a lot of, because I think it was obvious. I mean, Adam is the real person, and then there's a derivative of an Adam, that's an Eve, and that's the special case. And then somehow that's a secondary category. So that's the idea behind this man principle. And you see this also in language. Like you have what the Germans call Movierung. You have a special suffix in that you attach to nouns to make clear that you're talking about a female person, and the female not necessarily of having exactly the same occupation, for instance, but being attached to this. For instance, Apothekerin today would presumably be a female person who happens to be an apotheker. But in the old days, it could also just mean a female person who is connected to an apotheker, simply by virtue of being married to him. So, die Frau Apothekerin in the village would be the wife of the pharmacist and not a pharmacist herself necessarily. So it started out as actually I didn't know about the good English translation for that, the Zugehörigkeitssuffix, the connection or affiliation suffix somehow, that relates the referent of the in to another referent without the in. So the Apothekerin is somehow related to the apotheker, by marriage or some other connection. And only later it became the feminine, a marker of femininity as such. So nowadays, Apothekerin would be a female person who has the job of being an apotheker. So, but anyway, what you see is it's morphological derivation. So you have the real form and then you have the feminine form, just for special type of woman, special type of person, females. Now, well, there are several things to be said about that. One is that there are women around there who want to be heard and seen and acknowledged, and they believe that it's important that they are accepted in the same way as males are. That's one aspect. And also, of course, there's all other kinds of things going on. There are lots of people around who are unhappy about a clear binary system, and there are all kinds of of gender identities that are not necessarily new, but are more open in open public discourse now. So what do you do with all those people? I mean, that somehow have to deal with that. And so what's the problem there? From a social linguistic point of view, the idea would be to say that, oh, we have gender-sensitive language, we invent a certain form, and we'll see what happens. But people bother. And some people don't like this. And why is that? So that's what I want to talk about right now. So what are the reasons behind liking or not liking some of those forms? Because that tells you something about why language change happens or does not happen. So basic idea is that Studenten in the masculine plural, referring to all kinds of people, somehow won't do. So somehow this is a bad thing, and we know about the reasoning behind that is that the masculine creates all kinds of cognitive asymmetries. So when all kinds of experiments that have been run, and you can look at the Nübling book I mentioned beforehand, that's the one where they give you lots of examples of proper psycholinguistic and cognitive linguistic experiments where they show that when you talk about a group of people as Studenten, the probability that more men are conceived of than women, let alone people of other genders, is just very high. So Studenten entails masculinity somehow in our cognitive representations. So therefore, it's not a good idea to have only masculine plurals if you want to have a gender-sensitive language use. So that's why people came up with all kinds of ideas of how to remedy this problem. Here you see a couple of examples of what people have proposed. Back in the old days, they had Studentinnen with a capital I right in the middle of the word, the Binnen-I. You can have it with an understroke or with a gender star, a colon. You could have Stutz, Studi, and you can have these understrokes anywhere in the word. So there are various proposals around. My favorite one, the one that actually I use, is the one on the right-hand side. Because I'm an old man, I grew up with the Binnen-I, with the capital I right in the middle of a word. And at the same time, I completely abolished capital letters in my writing. So I turn up with, for me, I end up with Studentinnen, written like here on the right-hand column, which immediately means that I've got a generic feminine, and I'm referring to all people as all groups of people as Studentinnen, irrespective of whether they're men or women or whatever in there. So that's admittedly a playful way of doing it, which has not been adopted by everybody in the population yet. But there are ways of playing around with these things, and people do different things. Same as with, we've got this diversity, let's say, problem. You can have all kinds of neo-pronouns you can use. In English, most famously now, you have the singular they. The French yell, I already mentioned. In contemporary German, you have forms like sie, en, they, Maus, being as third-person singular pronouns of gender non-binary gender, or at least not gender indefinite usage. And if you sniggered about mouse, you don't believe it. The thing is, I don't use it either. But just last week, a colleague of mine sent me this picture from a bookshop in Marburg. It's called Roter Stern bookshop. It's a not particularly right-wing bookshop, I should say. And they have a poster saying "Keine Macht für Niemaus," which obviously alludes to an old anarchist song, "Keine Macht für Niemand." And there you can see there are people playing around with this, and there's something going on in the language right now. I'm not quite sure that this will actually go through as a good example. My impression today is that people well, I don't use many of those forms anyway, but I guess the most probable candidate from today, I should say, would be they, some D-E-Y, the one that's being used of those neo-pronouns. As I said, there's lots of them around, and it's the jury is still out which one is going to win out in the long run, but at least there's something happening there. So why is all this the fuss anyway? Why show you all some pronouns? Fair enough. Let's use those new forms. Everybody's included and everybody's happy. Oh, that's right. Let's do it. or maybe not. There are potential obstacles to that. There are two types of obstacles to any kind of neo-pronoun and language change happening in this area. And there are different sorts. One is grammar. The grammatical gender is very pervasive in some languages, unlike in English or in Swedish. In German, you have all kinds of grammatical forms where gender plays a role. You have relative pronouns, possessive pronouns, adjectival agreement. Just a couple of days ago, I spoke to Henrike, and she talked about a person, and she said, our principal, talking to somebody in her college, and that's our principal. This is gender neutral. I don't know, whatever gender this person might have. Then later, in the same conversation, we spoke German, and she said, unsere Principal. And there, speaking German, she immediately, using a possessive pronoun, she has to decide whether she says unsere Principal or unser Principal. So even if you play around with they and mouse and whatever as third-person singular pronoun, as soon as you start using a possessive pronoun, you again run into the problem of having to use a gendered form one way or the other. So if you're unlucky and speak German, grammatical gender is all over, and you have to deal with it in so many corners of your grammar that it's really difficult to do away with those gender insensitive forms. Contrast to a language like English or Swedish, where you have very little gender-relevant morphology, and therefore it's much easier to introduce a they, and that's about it. And actually, well, if you speak Russian, you're even more unlucky than Germans, because then that's a language where gender comes into play even in other areas of grammar. For instance, if you have a verb in the past tense, you have to conjugate the verb according to the gender of the subject of this particular sentence. So it can be even worse than in German, I should say. But at least German is one of those gender-prone languages in terms of grammar. And then there's another aspect, potential obstacles. It's about society and about changing norms. So let me briefly think about norms and what they are. Because norms are hard to change anyway, even if they're unequally strict. So norms in language sense are usually just usage norms. They're not legally binding. You're not going to jail if you use the wrong form. But if you say Brötchen instead of Semmel in a certain area, or the other way around, or if you say die Gefahren des Internets or die Gefahren des Internet, so whether you're using the genitive as the yes or no, both are right. Both are done. And it could well be that you sound a bit odd if you use one of them in the wrong context, but it's still a fluid, not legally binding norm. So that's one aspect to it. It's not a real hard norm anyway, but nonetheless, people take these norms very seriously, in at least in their own thinking, and I'll show you that in a second. But first of all, who creates those norms anyway? Have you ever thought about who creates linguistic norms and who says, who tells me what to do or what not to do? I mean, there's several aspects to that. There's a norm authorities like school teachers or a semi-official organization, die Rat für Deutsche Rechtschreibung, a partly government-funded body that is responsible for deciding what is a good orthographic word and what is not. You have norm experts, linguists, who know about the actual use of people, so who do corpus linguistics and do actual studies of actual real language use, but also people who know the psycholinguistic facts behind these usages. So that's what we are, the experts. And you have all kinds of model writers, model speakers, media, and role models, and people usually get habituated of what these people are doing. So people in the media are using one form or the other, and all the people who watch those media or read those media get used to it by just watching or reading that. And you have the speech community, basically everybody who accepts or adopts those forms or does not accept and adopt those forms. So let me go briefly through those norm setting elements. So authorities, it's an interesting case because state intervention generally is quite rare. You don't have this very often. And if you do it, most cases that I'm aware of have to do just with the writing system. Most famously, Turkish spelling reform in the 1920s when they had started. Before that, Ottoman Turkish was written with Arabic letters, and now they changed over to the Roman alphabet, and they also did away with certain loanwords and introduced French loanwords and in part of the modernization process of Turkey in the 20s. So that's one aspect, and the other way is, again, having to do with the writing system, simplified characters in the People's Republic of China, which was introduced in 1956, only in the People's Republic, but not in Hong Kong and in Singapore and other areas. So this is real state intervention, where the state tells you what to do. Otherwise, it doesn't happen that often. The Rat für Deutsche Rechtschreibung is one of those state institutions that do play a role there. And they say on their own self-description, they say, in der Regel regelt die Rechtschreibung innerhalb derjenigen Institutions, School and Verwaltung, für die der Staat Regelungskompetenz hat. So it tells you immediately, it's quite defensive. So there's a lot of Rechtschreibung going on out there in the world, and they don't care about that. They are only responsible for what's happening in certain institutions like schools and other public bodies. Apart from that, the Rat für Deutsche Rechtschreibung doesn't have any authority to do anything. But at least in those, they do have a certain Regelungskompetenz, and they have this, what they call Vorbildcharakter, so something that you can orient yourself to if you are unsure about certain things. And then there's another authority that some people think is important. It's called the Duden, book, which is completely irrelevant. This is it's a private company. It's a business-making institution. It's a firm, and they want to earn money, and they print books and write Duden on it. And people think they are important, and people ascribe a certain authority to them. But officially, it's just happens to be just one publisher who publishes lots of interesting books, but is not authoritative in the sense that you should. It can be enforced whatever they're doing. It just happens to be a famous book publisher with a good name to it and all that. So that's it's somewhat different in other countries, like the Académie Française, for instance, has a lot more authority and more power when it comes to Regelungskompetenz, the competency to change and to prescribe certain things. So in the French case, they do have a state-funded agency to talk about language. Germany doesn't. So apart from this Rechtschreibung bit. Now, experts, this is people like myself who publish books and papers in academic journals, and there's also people like myself and other linguists, I should say, who appear in general media, who are part of this public debate. And I just give you one interesting example I found quite fascinating. A couple of years ago, there was in a Forschung und Lehre, which is a monthly journal similar to the Times Higher Educational Supplement, where they discussed various things about education. There was a paper by a retired linguist, I'm semi-linguist, I should say, but reluctant here, and who said that, well, and I'm paraphrasing, there are all those gender-sensitive neoforms, like the gender star and they and all that, and they are purely driven by ideology, whereas all linguists accept the generic masculine, and no linguist dislikes masculine forms. That's slightly the paraphrase of this particular article, which meant that in the next issue of the same journal, there were about an open letter by more than 200 linguists who identified themselves as being one of those linguists who do dislike masculine generics. So what you see here is it's just the attempt of silencing a major segment of academia by just stating they don't exist. So there is something going on there in the public debate. It's not so much in the public debate in terms of argumentative, putting back and forth arguments and good evidence for or against one or the other form, but by cancelling or trying to cancel a certain type of public opinion of expert opinion in the public mind. Now, the other type of person that is relevant are model writers and speakers, people who appear on the media as far as they're still being used by the younger generations. And for instance, there was a discussion in Germany on the glottal stop, or the use of the forms like StudentInnen, when they were introduced in on national television by some presenters for the national news, and then there was a large public debate whether this is a good thing or not. So there are these model people who have a certain influence because lots of people listen to them and might get used to what's happening in the media. And in a sense, the discussion here is similar to the orthographic reform of the mid-90s, when there were certain newspapers, for instance, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who introduced its own house orthography because they refused to accept the spelling reform and had their own spelling, which was much more conservative than the reformed spelling situation. And over the years, they silently moved towards the new form as well. And now they're writing just like any other newspaper. So apparently this was an unsuccessful attempt to stay with the old form, and they gradually move to the new form as well, simply because people get used to the new forms. Because lots of model writers, model speakers use them. So at a certain point, you sound odd if you use the old form. And in that sense, it becomes usual just to use the new form. So that's what I said here. You have those role models, and people get used to them eventually, to the new forms. Schools and universities, people like us, we are important because there's an important locus of socialization of young people. So that's why they learn these things. And also we have the possibility to sanction norm-deviant behavior. Well, you shouldn't do this too much in terms of language, but at least that's what the institution school is all about sanctioning norm-deviant behavior one way or the other. And there's also guidelines for gender-sensitive language usage, and more recently for non-discriminatory language use in terms of ethnicity, ability, and various other personal traits people might have. But none of them are very strict. All of them are guidelines and helpful ideas of what you could do. However, there's the opposite thing, namely the prohibition of what I call gender language by certain politicians and government, like, for instance, the government of Bavaria or certain conservative party-led ministries have decided to forbid the use of what I call gender language. So again, there's something going on there about the authorities and who would be allowed to use one or the other of those forms. And lastly, speech community, everybody who uses one of those forms, and for all of us, it's become, in German context, it's become highly indexical which form you use. If you insist on using die Studenten all the time, it tells everybody else that you are against woke ideology and you're in the conservative camp. If you do it the other way around, you tell everybody that you find it's morally necessary and important to have these forms for non-discriminatory linguistic behavior. So this immediately has effects on your likability and your communicative and your social success, which is at stake. So what you see here, I think that's an interesting case. If you're using the wrong adjective declension or whatever else, it might be wrong grammar, but in a sense it doesn't make much of a difference to your social success. If you use one or the other of those forms, depending on the circles where you're around, where you hang out, depending on the kind of people you hang around with, one or the other of those forms might enhance or diminish your social status with those people. So in that sense, it's an interesting case of language change happening right now, right before our eyes, and having lots of social repercussions in everyday life among everybody who loses these languages. And the question, why is that so? It's because language is it's constitutive for our personality and our individuality. My regional dialect, the way I use orthography, the old one or the new one or a completely different one, this has all got to do with my personality, the way I feel. And there's a basic idea by lots of people who say stuff like, what I learned when I was young, that's right. So that was back in the old days, I learned something that's good, and everything that's changed after that, that's somehow bad. So that's the idea that's happening in there. That's why it's so difficult and to have so fraught with potential problems to have change in this area. If you want to read more about that, there's a very good book by Henning Lubins called Sprachkampf. Tells you that language is actually an easy battlefield for culture wars in general. And he looks at institutions like the Verein Deutsche Sprache, which is a far right-wing group of people who are very much engaged in public discourse and with regard to language. And what you see there is that, in fact, they are not really interested in language, but they are interested in language, but only in as much as there's something deeper going on. Because in polite society, usually you cannot say that you are against foreigners, but it's easy to say you are against foreign words. And also, it's a bit difficult to say I'm against ethnic minorities, and I just don't like certain ethnic minorities, but to say, I don't like the prohibition of the N-word, that's much easier to say in polite society. So in a sense, what they're doing, they're having culture wars going on there, but they're not saying it officially, but what they're doing is they're talking about language, and underlyingly, there's much more going on in terms of political differentiations. So that's what makes those cases so interesting, but also so dangerous in a sense. Gender is particularly contested here because I guess, I'm not sure, probably because it's the basis of one of the bases of our categorizations of our worldviews in general. It can also call into question the individual's self-image of all of us. And in a sense, I think the world is quite complicated, and I like this, but there are other people who might find it a nuisance that everything is so complicated. And if you're one of those people, all those neo-forms make life very difficult for a certain period at least. And that's why it somehow questions all my basic assumptions about good and bad and male and female and all the other things that are out there. So in that sense, people get upset about gender much more than they get upset about other aspects of language. So what shall we do? I think as historically interested social linguists or as social linguistically interested language historians, I think there's several ways to go. One is to say, punt away anyway. So things happen, and change is always happening. So fair enough, so that's change happening. Let's watch it and enjoy it, and that's about it. And there's a nice saying in Cologne, that gut wird gut. It comes the way it comes. We'll never see. We sit out there, we watch what's happening. As linguists, I think we somehow should engage in the public debate about these things and be informed about things, because we happen to know more about many of those aspects than lay people, because we've studied, run psycholinguistic experiments and all that, so we are knowledgeable, and we should feed this knowledge into the general public and the general debate, but in the same sense say something, it's good. It's not my job to change the world. It's my job to watch it and to help other people be informed about all the things that are happening there, be it the political social linguistic side to it, or the psycholinguistic backgrounds to all that. It's our job to inform the public, but that's about it. Now, if you know Spanish, you would get a joke here. It's in Spanish. You could I would have to say, as a group of people here, I have to say vosotros because it's a mixed group. Or you can see one of those forms where it's difficult to pronounce vosotros or something, you, plural. And you have now something to think about and something you might want to do in the future. The very last slide is this one. If you want to read more about any of those things, here are 2 publications had already been published, and one that is just in preparation about the things that I've said today. And that's about it. I've got an appendix about Chinese, but I'm going to leave that to some other occasion, I guess, because my time is up if I see it correctly. Fair enough. Thank you.
Many thanks. Fascinating stuff. And it has again shown for me also that the early New High German period is so fascinating, what's going on and how it's rebuilding German. If you want to hear more on early New High German, next week, which will be the last lecture in this series, we have Victoria Thomas coming, who's teaching some of you in the paper 4 tutorials, and she's speaking on syntactical matters and how they change in the early New High German period, which again turns out to be a bit of a Kugelkopf period for language. And I think you should have the appendix on Chinese.
Oh. You want to have 3 minutes on 3 minutes on Chinese?
Go, but I would like to have the appendix on Chinese.
Okay, there you go. The interesting thing about Chinese is that Chinese is a massively authoritarian society. It's a dictatorship over there. But still there's language change going on in Chinese language with regard to gender, and which has to do with the Chinese writing system. And to understand this, you need to know something, very little bit about Chinese pronominal system. As such, you have wo, ni, and da as the three singular pronouns, and da is third person singular, no gender at all. Spoken language, it's da, high tone, and it's just third person singular. Doesn't tell you anything about gender. Now, in written Chinese, they introduced this in sometime around 1900 when they translated texts from Western literature into Chinese. They have now developed two different forms in the written language for this, and see this in the first line. Both are pronounced da, but one is the third person singular masculine, and the other is the third person singular feminine pronoun in written language now. And this means that one is the masculine, is not coincidentally, one of the internal bits of this Chinese character on the left-hand side is the radical for man, for person, which then becomes the masculine pronoun. Person is masculine. This is a man principle, male is norm. And at the same time, you have the woman radical that goes into the third person singular feminine pronoun. So what you have today in the spoken language, you have ta, and in the written language, you have two different forms. Okay, males and females. And so they've created a written problem that they do not have in the spoken language, but in writing, they've come up with this problem now of being similar to our ASC. And now we have to deal with that. So what do? They have new. One way is to have a new pronoun. You have the same second bit after pronoun and the radical x being the neuter pronoun, so similar to a they singular form. And more recently, and that's actually that's what got me excited about the Chinese in this case, is they had introduced pinyin into Chinese character texts. So what's happening? Pinyin is the traditional way of transcribing with Latin, with the Roman alphabet, Chinese spoken language. So what's happening here is they have a conventionalized written form that indicates binary gender. Those two forms of the ta that you saw before. And this is unlike the oral language, okay? And now what they do is they have a Latin-based representation of a neutral pronunciation as a way out. Because both of those forms at the top are pronounced in the same way, ta. But now if you write it in Chinese characters, you have to decide which one you use. You have to decide between he and she. But if you do not do it like this, but if you have a written text in Chinese characters with introducing pinyin, the second line, so to speak, the problem dissolves. And this is exactly what happens. You see, it might be difficult to see here. That's an Instagram post exactly a year ago, last year on Valentine's Day. This is a Chinese character text. Okay, fair enough. Some advertisement for something. But right in the middle, it's easy to overlook. You have Chinese text and ta written right in there, whenever they want to convey third-person singular pronoun. So they're using the Latin pinyin from writing to do away, to get around the problem of the Chinese characters. And I found this a fascinating thing, where they can play around with the writing system in order to be gender neutral. And that's something that's completely outside of the scope of the government policy. That's done by people on the ground, realizing that gender is a tricky thing and we want to do something about it. And luckily, our spoken language is fine, it's just got ta, but unfortunately, our written language, traditional written language, has a problem here. So they represent the oral in the written, and then the problem dissolves. I found this a fascinating way of bottom-up strategy in the Chinese system of playing around with gender and written language. So that's part of my appendix. Thank you.